Well, welcome everyone. I'm Kurt Kelly, and I'm with the Sunshine Unity Network, our Sunshine 100, which we should have effectively named the Sunshine 10,000. We are really growing the network. Thank you for so many of you that have been involved with us throughout the last 2 years, and particularly this last year. Let me just, I'm going to, in just a second, we're going to have our other two members of the Sunshine 100 speak a little bit, but I'm going to have Jennifer Webb actually introduce our guest today, the
Oh
Honorable.
no, that's to you, Kurt, because I have the PowerPoint. So I'm going to let you introduce Susan and I will advance the PowerPoint. It's good to see everyone. Happy election day and or post-election day and Thanksgiving holiday.
All right, yeah, and then we also see Lisa Lorenzo, who will be wrapping us up when we get toward the end there. We're the three here in the state. We've all become really good friends. We love working on this, even though we have different perspectives. And we think that's the real value, continuing to have the dialogue, continuing to have the conversations. And so we're very excited. But backed by popular demand, we have invited Dr. Susan MacManus. Dr. MacManus is well known across the state of Florida, probably across the United States, because I've seen her on national things, but also here in Florida as an expert, both in sort of election trends, election results, and polling. And last time we brought her on to talk to us about polling, what you could expect, how accurate they are, and so forth. We had a lot of good comments about that. But Dr. MacManus we've asked her to come back now after the election, particularly focusing on Florida, although she may bring some national stuff in. It's focusing on Florida and talking about the results of that. And we're just so honored to have her. I've seen her multiple times as she's out there talking across the state, and we're just really blessed to have her. Thank you for joining this Lunch and Learn. That should be Breakfast and Learn. Thank you guys for all joining us. And let me turn it over to Dr. MacManus. Susan.
Right. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Jennifer, thank you so much for taking on this task. Next. I'm just going to say next when I want her to go to the next slide. This is very important for people to get a feel for the context in which this election took place. And one of the very important measures is how people feel about the direction of the country. And one thing you'll notice from this slide was throughout the year, no matter what happened, people's opinions that the country was headed in the wrong direction remained stable. So it was clear it was going to be an election about change. Next slide. Obviously, one of the uniquenesses was that Trump won both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, which people anticipated the Electoral College, but were not at all predicting the winning of the popular vote. Next slide. And of course, a real change in Congress. We still have some, I guess, seats to count in the House a bit, but nonetheless, so the president-to-be will enter with a trifecta, which happens every so often in politics. And what this means is, for what you all are interested in, unity and discussions and trying to get rid of polarization, it means that they're going to have to act really quick and prove that they can govern. And that's what happens when you have a trifecta. The expectations of change are very, very high. Next slide. We had a landslide Trump win in Florida. You'll notice from the map there it was a 13% plus margin. People saw a similar margin in 2022 governor's race, and we thought it was very unusual, but this is a replication of it. You'll notice that only 6 of our 67 counties went blue, and it was South Florida, Broward, and Palm Beach, Alachua, Orange County, which is Orlando, Alachua, Gainesville, and then in the Panhandle, Leon and Gadsden. And of course, that pattern is interesting, but we usually have more blue counties, and we'll see some trends in that front. Next slide. It was a burden to bear for the Harris campaign that in the exit poll, which was done for all the major networks by Edison Research, they're the ones who do the exit polls, meaning you actually contact people who voted. It was this was obviously of people who voted. They really didn't see the Biden administration as very effective. And obviously, if you're part of that administration, it increased the burden for Harris campaign astronomically, but this is what it looked like in Florida, is that a huge portion disapproved of the way that the president was governing. Next slide. This is an important one. You might look at it and say, why? Well, the biggest gains, the darker the red, the more the gain in Trump vote over 2020. And you'll notice New York and New Jersey, and of course, Florida, Texas, California. During the campaign, a lot of the Republicans were complaining that they weren't seeing the grassroots activity, and they were worried that there wouldn't be turnout for the Republicans in the various states. What this map shows, and well, let me say, a lot of them were saying, why is Trump going to New York and New Jersey and California? Those are deep blue states. All along, this was part of the popular vote strategy, that they would build up votes, knowing they wouldn't win in those states, but they would build up enough votes to win the popular vote. And of course, Florida was part of that calculation. Next slide. This is a really interesting map that was done. This comes from Financial Times, had a really excellent analysis of all the data. And you'll notice that the arrows and the color reflect changes in the individual counties. And you see Florida, almost every increase was towards Trump and towards the Republicans. But you can see the heavy concentrations of where there was blue, where there was red. But clearly Florida was moving redder, as was most of the Southeast, but including some of the northern states. I mean, even Virginia, New Jersey. Next slide. This was a really interesting analysis that was done by the Associated Press, which took 2016 as the baseline. These are Florida counties, and looked at how much the counties had changed in the 2016 and the 2020 race. So you notice between 2016 and 2020, how many of the counties moved redder in Florida. And then the 2024, it was 90 plus counties percent moved in a redder direction. So Florida was clearly transitioning red. And I've said many times, many of you have heard me speak, it was COVID that really changed the direction of Florida politics more than any other factor, and people moving in and out and what happened after. Next slide. A bit of a surprise to many people who follow Florida politics, and this was sort of a national trend. The urban vote was more split than usual, and that came as a surprise. And you see that the suburban vote was a little bit heavier red than we had anticipated. The rural vote all along we anticipated would be heavily red, but it was that urban vote, and we'll see it was generally driven by some low turnout among Democrats, but also among the Republicans. Voting people were some of the minority groups, which moved a bit towards red, and we'll see mostly because of the economy. Next slide. And when asked, this is a very important question, when asked which one of these four candidate qualities mattered most to you and how you decided who to vote for, you see clearly the highest percentages picked leadership skills, followed by the ability to change things. The traditional things like cares more about me or better judgment just didn't grab that higher percentage of the voters of Florida. Again, constantly think of this change theme, and you see it reflected here. Next slide. Very interesting analysis of the national data by the Financial Times. It was really, really good, and it shows a problem that Florida and nationally Democrats are having now, is a growing awareness that they have really lost a lot of the working class vote and are now increasingly becoming a party more of educated and wealthier Americans. And this, of course, is part of what political scientists refer to as partisan realignment, where the parties are switching places in terms of the constituency basis. And this is a really good example of how that has happened over time and culminated in the 2024 election. Next slide. Another one from the same data set. It shows again looking at why people like the Democratic Party and the percent of the reasons gone. And, in the 60s, it was they represent the working class. And you can see how that blue line just over time has dipped down. But where Democrats are making headway is on climate change and on caring for healthcare and marginalized groups. As an analyst, it was really clear to me from looking at data before and after that Democrats really missed the boat on a key issue of healthcare and childcare. I think now looking back, they probably should have paid a little bit more attention to the growing concern about that from actually a very bipartisan perspective. Next slide. Great slide again, analysis here, Financial Times, showing how the Democrats on cultural issues have really moved beyond far to the left of the median voter, which of course is people who identify half above and half below. And you can see it on both the affirmative action and on immigration. So this kind of gives good context to why what happened did. As an analyst, and sometimes I speak to partisan groups on both sides, I point out you've got to do really deep dive look at demographic shifts to get a good strategy for winning an election. And a state like Florida changes so fast that if you don't watch this stuff constantly, you can really make a mistake. Next. Another really punchline to the economy is the big issue. This shows across the country that the places with the highest cost of living actually moved more towards Trump. Next slide. Amazingly, I had seen this, but when preparing for this, I saw it, go back through my data again, and it was so interesting that prices, an analysis by the Pew Research Center of some national data, had shown that two areas in Tampa and obviously Miami, among all of the big metro areas, were experiencing the most price increases, which explains again why the loss of some of the vote for Democrats in the metropolitan areas, but also why the economy was just the real story here in this state. Next slide. I don't often cite Bernie Sanders, but in this particular instance, he really nailed it with this comment. Of course, he took a lot of flack nationally. This made national news, and he got into an argument with others within the Democratic Party. But when you look at the data, he pretty much had hit the nail on the head with this comment that when you lose the working class, you really abandon them and he was speaking, of course, of the cultural issues and so forth that affects the party and its successes in the election. Next. Looking at Florida and the economy being the top issue, which one of these 5 issues mattered most and how you decided who to vote for. The state of the economy, you notice what a high proportion picked that one. And of course, the vote there was clearly more Republican. I also call your attention to 2 other features here. Look at the small percentage that cited abortion as their top issue. And we saw this in pre-election polls too. It was never polling as a top issue, and yet it was a major focus of the Democratic campaign, both nationally and in Florida. But also notice the one at the bottom, the state of democracy, a very small percentage, even though still a significant, pick that as their major issue. And again, the threat to democracy theme just didn't really resonate with a lot of people. The wording of it just was a little bit unclear, I think, as to what that meant. As we'll see a bit later, both parties feared the other one would destroy democracy, and that was showing up in pre-election polls as well. Next slide. So here they asked Floridians, and this is also national, very similar patterns. That's one thing you notice about a lot of this is just Florida is the bellwether for the rest of the country in explaining a lot of things. But here people were, for the most part, saying that the economy was not so good and voted Trump. And then at the bottom, it was a key for me, looking at the personal feelings about their finances. a huge percentage there said it had worsened, almost half. And you can see the vote on that matter. So personal financial situation and prices, something that affected a much larger portion of the voting electorate than sheer party issues alone. Next. This threat to democracy, it wasn't a particularly highly partisan issue in this state. You can see pretty even a percentages of people. Do you think democracy is better or secure or threatened? It really didn't make much difference in the voting patterns, which shows that it wasn't a particularly driving or motivating factor in how people were voting. Next slide. So looking now at after the fact, looking back, these are headlines pulled from some of the state nation's big papers. The Democrats were really thinking abortion would motivate them, and then they also quickly adopted the anti-Trump message, feeling that that was the only way that they could really call less attention to the fact that Harris was part of the administration in power. Next slide. This was again from The Hill. A lot of you are familiar with this publication, the headline here, which I think nailed it again. She just couldn't ever really connect with those families on economic concerns, Harris. And obviously, Carville was right on this one, that when it's people suffering at home and a broad breadth of people suffering financially, that's what they want, something different. And that's where the change and the voting for Trump, even though polls show a lot of people didn't like him personally, they just wanted to change in policy. And the economy was the issue they focused on. Next slide. So Democrats everywhere misread the abortion as the biggest issue. These were all the states that had an abortion amendment on the ballot. And you'll notice that the amendment got more support than the candidate. And that was not an expected outcome from the perspective of the Harris campaign. They were convinced, and Democrats as well, that if you voted yes for these abortion amendments, that you would vote yes on Harris as a candidate. It just didn't pan out. Next slide. Yes. So this is very interesting to me. Abortion is a very complex issue, even though we try to describe it as so simplistic, yes or no. But you can see that, people have different grades of support or opposition if you look at different levels of abortion rights. And you really see it here that, if you were in favor legally, you were more Harris, but look at what percentage of people who were in favor of the bottom one there on Amendment 4 that were Republicans. And all along, I attended the Florida Democratic Party convention this summer for my television station I'm an analyst for, and they had a very interesting program where at the time they were talking about how to get Amendment 4 passed. And from the get-go, the Florida Democratic Party was always aiming at winning a lot of the Republican vote. And you see here, it wasn't a very, absolutely partisan issue on this, but the key is to remember it was only about 11% that picked this as their top issue. Next. So quickly, let's look at how Florida changed. I'm going to show you the demographics of our registered voters and then the poll that kind of goes with it. Next slide. And these, of course, are the things that are so different. They make we've talked about in the polling session, these things make it very difficult to do polling in Florida because our population makeup changed even throughout the year of the election. Next slide. So nationally and in Florida, the demographic groups that everybody was focusing on were Latinos and women and young voters and, of course, swing voters. Next. So this is the trend. This is actually through book closing, the actual registration trends in our state. Clearly, Democrats losing stream and the NPAs slightly gaining, even though it dipped a little bit in 2024, but clearly a 7% difference between registered Democrats and Republicans. Next. And of course, the trend beginning again with COVID, you see just how the COVID really was the turning point for the gains of Republicans in Florida. Next slide. This is a very, very important one for the parties going forward. More and more people, you saw that purple line, more and more people are saying they're not aligned with either party. And you can see here that if I had had a when this started was about 2 or 3 cycles back, the number just keeps growing in terms of counties where NPAs outnumber one of the 2 major parties. Next. This is asking Floridians how they look at themselves. I think a key on the top one is no matter how you voted, do you think of yourself today as? This isn't registration, this is the exit poll. Look at people who participated in this. More people that are independents were a larger share of who voted in Florida than Democrats. And this is a serious problem going forward. And of course, more people do consider themselves moderates, which is a good sign for trying to build coalitions. And then among first-time voters, this was a shock because usually first-time voters, a lot of them are young. This was sort of a surrogate for the young vote, but it was the fact that it was split between Harris and Trump was pretty interesting to a lot of us. Next. So ours is one of the most diverse from a racial perspective of any state. Obviously, Hispanics are outnumbering Blacks, and that trend is continuing, which is, again, the focus on Latinos was heavy inside Florida and across the country. Next. And here, I think this is important because we tend to have these ideas that groups are monolithic, but the Hispanic registrants and Asian registrants and other, which would be multi or biracial groups, the plurality are registering as no party affiliation. But the other 2 parties are very split within those groups. So we have a very diverse population racially and ethnically. And even within those groups, there's a lot of diversity in terms of party affiliation. Very interesting. Next slide. And of course, no need to tell anybody on this call, we have the most diverse Hispanic population. And obviously, country of origin is a big part and heritage, a big part of the Latino vote. These groups don't all share politics, nor do they share the same culture. And that's what makes micro-targeting critical in a state like ours, which is what drives up the challenges for parties who are, when underfunded, can't really do the analysis they need to do to micro-target. And that was what was happening to Florida Democrats, not getting the outside money that they're used to from the national coffers. The next slide. Same thing with the Asian communities here, very different. For example, we know Vietnamese tend to vote Republican, whereas the most Democratic voting are those from India, but a lot of differences here as well. And the next slide will show the same thing is true among our Black population. We have such a sizable Caribbean population in South Florida, and there's often a lot of diversity within those groups, but also sometimes tensions between them and American-born Blacks, which we see more of this kind of politics in Southeast Florida. Next slide. But this was a comment that was made by MSNBC opinion that was published that you can't assume that these groups are monolithic. And not only are they not monolithic in terms of their cultural and racial backgrounds, but they have other identities that shape how they view the world. And there was too much of the one-size-fits-all approach to the women's vote, the Black vote, the Latino vote, the young vote. There isn't any such thing as one-size-fits-all in describing those groups in Florida or increasingly elsewhere. Next slide. And it shows again the diversity in Florida's racial groups and in their candidate choice. And obviously, you see that the most solidly and consistently cohesive as you can get vote in Florida is the Black vote. But we'll see a little bit later. Even that was split when you break it down by gender. And then you see even among the Cuban one, the next to the last one there, are you of Cuban descent? Again, they weren't all on the same page, and neither were those of Puerto Rican descent. And that's, of course, a big part of Florida's population, particularly in Central Florida around Orange County. So we see here what others need to learn from is that, you know, the one size fits all from the party's perspective is outdated. It's not really that useful if you're trying to develop a winning motivation and turnout strategy. Next slide. This was unbelievable, how much that Trump won Florida's Latino, both men and women. But it also shows what Republicans were citing nationally in some of their national programming about Black men. And you see it was true in Florida that 21% of young Black men, mostly young, voted for Trump. And when that's more deeply analyzed, it's a lot about the economy. But increasingly, we see the gender gap, particularly among men of color, is a lot because the women, there's an educational difference. The younger men are not going as far from an educational perspective, so you tend to have a feeling among some of them that it's the women that are getting all the attention, and people are ignoring, you know, minority men, particularly Black men. We've seen some polls that show that kind of thing. Next slide. So to me, this is always the most fascinating thing. I've been college prof. You always think about the younger generation. You interface with them all the time. But this was an incredibly new development within our state, is the two youngest generations and how diverse they are in terms of party. And in each group, the Gen Zers and the millennials, plurality is still the leader. But look at the split between the Democrat and Republican young people is almost equal between Democrats and Republican. And this is actual registrants, whereas the older generations you see are much more Republican leaning. But the younger demographic, which is 35% of our registered voters in Florida this year, is really confounding, complex, and a lot of people miss the boat in how to target these younger demographics. Democrats tend to use Hollywood pop stars. Republicans tend to use influencers like Joe Rogan and others that were more driven by, social media. Next slide. And obviously, same slide, just breaks it down a little bit more, showing that the younger generations are much more split and divided in how they voted than anybody anticipated. Next slide. So this is really obvious on the millennials, which is that 30 to 39 roughly age group. Democrats still, when you break it down to the little pieces, still more of them are voting Democratic, but it starts to fall apart once it reaches the millennials. And a lot of people attribute this to, these are the groups that owe their college loans paid off, have young kids, a lot of economic pressure on particularly older millennials. Next slide. Women, again, Florida, unlike the rest of the country in terms of this, is that our women's voters were almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. And this August analysis of actual registrants showed for the first time that I can recall where the percent of women voters was 1% higher for Republicans, but it's all basically equal. And of course, for men, lean Republican. And unreported, we know, are younger voters and usually people who don't buy a binary definition of gender. And you can see there why the plurality is much. The plurality is clearly for NPA. Next. So the gender gap was pretty wide, but not as bad as people, or not as big as people had anticipated in our state. The significance is that it's the gap is widest between persons of color, particularly Latino men and women, and also Black men and women. And I think we've already discussed some of the reasons for that. A lot of it's the educational issue, as well as a feeling among some of the men that they haven't been, their issues are often passed over when everyone's talking about the first woman president, the first woman this, the first woman that. We even started seeing some discussion about how this is affecting younger men in the K through 12 ranks. And I think educators are now focusing on this feeling of the younger men starting to feel marginalized. And it's an interesting development. Next. And this speaks in a way to something really interesting. Going forward, it's really interesting in our state to see that among men, that they percentage who are registered, this is actual registrants, is higher among MPAs than it is Democrats, and the reverse is true among women. But obviously, women are a plurality of the Democratic vote among these two younger generations, and that's why we're seeing a lot of younger women starting to run for offices, particularly local and state legislative races in our state. Next. So it was huge, but as I say, the gender gap wasn't that much. And we've seen that the gender gap helped Trump gain among younger voters, that and the economy. Next slide. Now, education in a lot, the national exit poll shows a much sharper divide between educational level and vote. With the highly educated, the national polls will show that people with advanced degrees and college degrees are the only two educational level groups that voted heavily for Harris. Florida, interestingly, was a little bit more split in terms of how much education gaps there were between, the achievement levels and how people voted. I found that the most interesting probably side of all of this in a way. Next slide. So he still did best among Trump, among the working class in our state. But as I said, it really was not the level it was in the national exit poll across the country. Next. This is fascinating. This was an analysis done of looking back over time, how closely education and income are tied together. The person who did this analysis split the populace into 4 quadrants. So you see the upper right, higher education, high income, lower quadrant, high education, low income, and then the opposite on the other side. So if you start with, let's start with the blue. If you start with the 1996 race, with the Clinton race, you'll notice that the voters, the bulk of his support came from people with low income and low education. And then you go next to Obama, and then you go up to Biden, and then it ends up where the quadrant ends up. And this is what's very bothersome and really causing a lot of consternation and talk among the Democrats, is that now the Democrats have the majority of the support is coming from people with higher education, higher income. And you look at the reverse, the red line starts with Dole in 1996 in the upper quadrant, but ending up with Trump in the lower quadrant of low income and low education. And this is an example of, or proof in a way of, we've had a party realignment in this country. Next. So quickly here, turnout fell. You can see the groups on the left where it fell overall, and you can see on the right where how much there was a loss of support from those groups, from the Democrats. Just what we've been talking about, blacks and college grads were less so, and Hispanic voters a bit more. Next slide. This just continues this, and it shows again the larger loss of some of these groups among Democrats than among parties overall, the turnout overall. This is turnout figures. Next. So we had the highest voter turnout in 30 years. We are one of a handful of states where turnout actually increased. And we went from 77%, which was a high in decades in 2020. It's looking like it isn't finalized, closer to 79%, but 78.7 or whatever. So I think Florida can feel really good about this. And you can see some other areas where we feel there's possibility of unity and less of the traditional pattern in terms of participation. Next slide. So some people blame the fact that, the Democrats just didn't speak the language of everyday people as well as did Bill Clinton and Obama, even though they didn't work for getting younger voters out. Next slide. I'm gonna run quickly through these because I know I'm running short on time here. People don't get their news the same way. Look at the bottom is newspapers and radio, just almost 4%. It's all digital and social media. And next slide. And we saw so much difference this year in what worked in campaigning and turning out people compared to the traditional. And clearly that mattered to getting some of those younger and younger voters attuned to turning out to vote and expressing their concerns. Next. And Van Jones, who's a Democratic black analyst for CNN, really pointed out the difference. He said that the Democrats use the old school for getting people out to vote, and the Republicans use the new school, which is more the podcasts and streaming and online. Next slide. So here are the things that we should be happy for. Not as much violence, a faster than expected results, a clear winner, less litigation, more acceptance of the results, and we're seeing a wonderfully smooth transition. And for me, and you, it's over. That's a good thing. Next slide. Coming to the end here. Election integrity. These are the things that people were really, really worried about before the election. We're convinced. Look at the huge percentages that thought that whoever lost wasn't going to accept it and that it would be all this fraud and whatever. Next slide. So blessedly, we didn't have that. And that's because of the victory being so clear. And as this subtitle says, at least despite all these conspiracies and security concerns, we didn't have any of that. And I feel so thankful. Next slide. And of course, people are accepting the results. That's good as well. 75% said it was legitimate. Next slide. So Florida, here again, we gave good marks. We were really confident that our elections were being held fairly and accurately, and I think that's an applaud to our state. Next slide. So polling's still a challenge. They underestimated Trump for the third time in a row now. We know there's some problems with polling. Next slide. We do know, and here's the good news, that polling on issues was pretty accurate. We see the ranking order here of issues. This is Florida, but it was true of the national. The polls are pretty good on that, but what they're not good, next slide, is on picking the winner. And they're not intended to, but yet the press treats them like that. And that's one of the problems. The last poll that was taken in Florida showed an 8% difference, and it ended up 13. It was never in doubt who was going to win here because we're a red state now. But in places where it was close, this could have been very deceiving and was. Next. So we can't predict turnout. And look at all these things that were headlines just 3 or 4 days before the election. And then at the bottom, we know the truth. It was underestimating on Trump. The late deciders, we have other evidence showing the late deciders about 40 or 50% moved. No, it was higher. It was a majority of the late deciders moved towards Trump. So they were good at getting late deciders, often low propensity voters, to the polls. Next. So take a bow, Florida, because we had just the other day people from Arizona coming into Florida to ask how to do better ballot counting and processing. And we called the election, shortly after 8 when the polls closed, and Arizona took 4 days, and California's still counting. I'd go figure. Finally, next slide. So I just want to say thank you for letting me present this to you and get a good feel, and you have a better feel and a good feeling about Florida. And I wish you all the most peaceful, joyous and whatever holiday and Thanksgiving, and go Florida. Thank you.
We want to go ahead and Go ahead, Kurt.
No, I was just going to say that was wonderful. Thank you. Lisa is going to now allow you just if you want to raise your hand, I'll try to call on you. And if you've got any questions, you've got the expert. You saw all of this. It was quick, but if you've got some questions or so forth, let's open it up. So I see Jen McDonald. Jen, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. MacManus. Good to see you.
How are you?
Good, thank you. You mentioned that the population isn't like monolithic and no sector has been monolithic across the population. But then overwhelmingly, we noted that Democrats totally missed the boat on economic issues and household kitchen table issues. So do you think that there is some monolithic way to address those issues better as Democrats that our opponents had done this cycle? Just trying to think about how we message in a better way that's more universal and uniting versus what we've had.
Yes, and I had a slide. I tried to make it within the time limit here that I tried to let you all ask questions. One of the big problems was the language that was used. And when I was giving pre-election speeches, I would go out to groups and they'd ask about this because, people point to the Biden administration as having some successes economically, but they weren't able to articulate that because go out and talk about, oh, the GDP has really increased, or the stock market, or, the inflation rate is dipped, but still up, things like that. The only thing that we know resonated with people was prices. And the national VoteCast survey that was done for the AP asked people about the prices, and a huge percentage said that they were struggling with groceries, number one, healthcare, number two, which is interesting, and gas, and then, of course, housing. So the language, this is where focus groups of working class people are essential to figuring out how do I better phrase this. The consultants at the top are all educated, and their language isn't in sync with the vocabulary of people who aren't college educated. And that was a huge problem. Harris could never really break through that. Plus, the bottom line was the question of were you better off today than you were 4 years ago was over resoundingly said, you saw it even in Florida where half said no. But it's language. And that's why issue polling is good, but then figuring out, and pretty accurate, then figuring out, okay, how do I articulate that language to somebody who hasn't gone to college, who's, working shift work or, part-time is all they can get. But good question.
Thank you. I think that last point is really something that we really have to take back as a party and discuss over and over again, because that's been missed probably 2.5 cycles in a row. And so I appreciate that last bit there about the language. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have Karen and I see Natalie, you're going to ask, but I want to, before you go there, Russell Myers has put in the chat, he did ask this question: what degree does Florida's older voter population ratio weigh the outcome for maybe Amendment 4?
We haven't seen very good breakouts of that. But, the thinking is that older women were, and this is true of other places, well, people have studied it, older women that went through the battle of getting reproductive rights, I suspect that, and even probably were more likely to vote. But the younger people, while they certainly support it, I can't stress enough the fact that in Florida, the young people are some of the most economically stressed. And I always use the example, what 21-year-old do you know willingly wants to live at home with mom and dad, but they can't afford to do anything else? So I think that the age thing was less of an explanator of how people voted on Amendment 4 than one might have anticipated.
Karen, we'll go to you.
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Susan. Really appreciate this. Your conversation 2 years ago, it really resonated through this election. I wish we had the people who had put together some of these campaigns had listened more to you on these points. My concern is, okay, now we've quelled and we're settled down. We've accepted the election results. How do we move forward in in our daily task of not taking how to explain this, how to quell some things that might come out of the party, out of the Trump camp that may cause some retribution. I know our original thought was that we were going to have some backlash had the election gone a different way. Now we're in it, and we're kind of in this kind of quagmire of, is there really going to be retribution? And I know, Dr. MacManus, this isn't your forte, but are you seeing any inklings of a concern in that area?
Well, I think, yes, there are people who are concerned, and obviously a lot of the discussion is coming up as he's releasing names of people who he wants to have in his cabinet and so forth. That's natural when you lose, you know, an election. And again, a lot of people, even Republicans, have some concerns about the language that he used on the campaign trail and whatever. It's just one of those things about politics. But I have noticed so far, and it's just anecdotal, that his language seems to be a little bit less of a flamethrower than before the election. Now, whether that lasts, I don't know. But we do know, and this is something that he obviously and people around him know. Go back to the Obama year when he first, won a major election and reversed the control. We do know that the first midterm after such a monumental election that shifts gears, so to speak, that the out party cleans up in terms of winning congressional seats. So that's got to be a thought, at least people that work for him. You asked me to predict Trump. I cannot, I'm hopeful.
Never asked that of you.
I'm hopeful that people are just taking a breath right now for the holidays. And I'm really saddened when I hear people say, well, I can't go to Thanksgiving because my uncle is so opinionated and da, da, da. This is the kind of thing that groups like this, it starts early on teaching respect. And I really hope that universities start doing a better job of trying to get groups together to learn why the other ones think differently than they do, because right now it's all about promoting differences, and that's not healthy to anyone, including the persons involved or society at large and our employees, etc.
Susan, that's what we're all about. Natalie, I see you're on. You have your hand raised.
Thank you. Susan, so I'm very curious. How did different parties, especially those individuals that were running for, president, an example would be Kennedy or even Gabbard before, that are different parties, and then they switched over, they came out actually and endorsed Trump, or Liz Cheney, who used to be a Republican, came over and endorsed Harris. How did that impact the voting?
Okay.
Did that really make a difference?
In retrospect, now this is just what I've been reading, and I try to read all the stuff that's come out, even though I'm losing my eyesight because of some of it, actually. But anyway, the Liz Cheney thing did not work very well, and it was because, and this was shown up, and I didn't show this. I don't know that I showed this. Suburban women, the women's vote went for Trump slightly in our state, but the suburban women's vote also went for him, which was unexpected, and Democrats were counting on that. But that was an example of where they were looking at policy. And the national poll, there's a great breakdown between people who said they didn't like him and another one, did they vote for him on policy? And it was clear that a higher percentage of people voted for Trump on policy, and they pushed aside some of his personal character issues that they don't like. So I think that that's a little bit of what you saw here. But Liz Cheney what now wasn't the type that was able, because a lot of the people said, well, she's just, not one of us anyway, that she's sort of the never, in other words, the never Trumper group never really had a lot of influence in terms of drawing away just everyday, voters when it comes to a presidential election. And it was clearly an economy election and a change election. A good question, though, really good.
So Bonnie writes, do you think the guardrails that have kept some sanity in our democracy is strong enough to save our democracy?
I do, but the one concern I have right now is the news media itself, is that you see we're having a major upheaval now in terms of ownership and selling off properties and whatever. And it's always been this way that media covers controversy and they delight on it because that makes people look at it and it sells ads. But the media has got to be a big part of repairing and how they address differences of opinion, instead of just making it, picking every comment that everybody made when they were in second grade and putting it up there as, given at that moment in time. It's not helpful. And before the election, it was already a problem because 31% of nationally don't trust the media at all. And so I think some of it has to be them stepping up to the plate and trying to be a little bit more balanced, going back to the era of great journalism in this country, where it was, you were rewarded and you won major professional accolades from covering things in a fairer way and actually uncovering, when they uncovered something, it was truly like Watergate, a mess that needed to be uncovered. And I'm not saying they're the only blame, but it's something without that picture. And of course, now it's even harder because social media is a major source of news, as you saw. And we are a siloed, people that if I get my news, let's say I'm a young person, especially from this influencer group and this website or this social media network, I don't pay attention to anybody else. And there's increasingly gone are the days when we had just a couple of networks and they all were on the same page sort of in how they approached it. Now it's 20 times different to try to rein things back in about willingness to listen to other people's viewpoints.
Probably have time for one more question if anybody has it. I'll also go down the path. Did we see any indigenous things? There was so much disinformation that was even from international sources and so forth. Did we hear more about that? Did some of that affect Florida? Did you hear anything about that?
Well, of course. I mean, everybody, pre-election polls were showing a lot of people were very, very concerned about AI and still are. And they were also very afraid of international involvement, which there was some, but fortunately they got that out nationally and addressed it. And it wasn't the problem that it was anticipated. But a lot of people worried that they weren't being given enough information or given the wrong information. But AI overall, if you said that, pre-election polls were showing a huge portion said they weren't going to be able to trust, AI because of AI. They weren't going to believe any political ads that they saw and so forth. So the technological shifts are happening in this country. It has to be absorbed into our politics. That's going to be a big challenge. But then again, I think sometimes it's the other kinds of media. We have a number of just not the big papers, but weeklies and very good other kinds of sources of media that are, to me, being staffed by people who are more aware, a little bit younger people, more aware of the needs to be able to reach across and reach into different segments of the society. But as you can see, we're getting more diverse. And I still liken Florida's politics to a giant jigsaw puzzle with thousands and, well, millions of pieces. How do you put together, a winning picture is getting increasingly really difficult, and people worrying about the integrity of the news media is a serious issue. But I do think that it was calmed a bit by the way that they've covered the results and how states have done from the election integrity perspective. I do see an improvement in the post-election coverage.
Yeah. Dr. MacManus, you've been amazing. We appreciate you as always. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to close us out today. Thank you guys for all getting on. Lisa?
I just want to acknowledge Nathan Stock, our program director for the Carter Center, I believe is on this call. I see a few of our other colleagues from Michigan and North Carolina, Jennifer and Tanya. Scott, I don't know if any of you can unmute and just say hi for a moment. But we just want to acknowledge you all for taking the time on a holiday week to come on here and continue to learn and grow. And we wish you all a very, very thankful Thanksgiving. And, you know, we have a little, in our link, we have our Facebook page and our website. So you guys can check that out. But honestly, our hope this Thanksgiving is that we can unite with family members who voted different than us and treat them with compassion and kindness and not react, but respond lovingly, honestly. So I hope that you guys all have a wonderful one. I see Tanya on, if you want to say hi, Tanya, real quick.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much, Dr. MacManus.
Tanya, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Shootmaker. I'm the right-leaning lead from Michigan.
And also a former
a former state senator.
Just that little thing.
Michigan Senate, and also a former state representative.
Thank you. And I know Jennifer Roberts is on. She was a former mayor of Charlotte in North Carolina.
Yep, I'm here, and great analysis. Really enjoyed the program. I'm the former mayor of Charlotte. North Carolina, was also a swing state and had some interesting things happen. So good analysis. Thank you.
All right, with that, guys, everybody, we love you. Appreciate you being a part of this. Let's continue to grow this. We're going to have a great 2025, and we want to continue this work. Dr. MacManus, you're wonderful as always. Thank you. To our Florida team, you guys are fantastic, and we appreciate everybody. With that, y'all have a great day. God bless, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you for joining.